My name is Kwasigan Tovivo, and I'm a senior implementation specialist working on adaptation and climate finance, and also serving as the director of Climate Analytics Africa Office, which covers climate analytics activities in the Africa region. And I will be your moderator for today's event. I have here with me today from climate analytics side, Deborah Ramaloki, who leads the climate policy team, Claire Stockwell, a senior policy analyst, and Kofi Kumasi, who is an implementation specialist. On NewClimate Institute side, we have Hannah Peketi, who co-founded NewClimate Institute and oversees and supports projects that track and evaluate climate action of different governments. Next slide, please. In terms of agenda today, we aim to keep the presentations to around 30 minutes. And Hannah is going to kick things off with a brief overview of how fossil gas is now the answer in a Paris-compatible world. Deborah will then shed a spotlight on enabling the renewable energy transition in sub-Saharan Africa. Claire will walk us through the importance of climate governance in attaining climate action. And Kofi will close out the presentations by highlighting the main findings of the climate governance analysis in some African countries. And after the presentation, we will have the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Before I hand it over to Hannah for our first presentation, I would like to remind of some of our housekeeping matters. This event is being recorded, and the recording and our slides will be made available on the CAT's website. And following the presentations, we will have the Q&A sessions. To submit a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen as showed on the screen. And feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentations. There is no need to wait until the Q&A session starts. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible during the time allocated for this event. To avoid multiple channels open, we have disabled the chat function. If you are encountering technical difficulties, please also use the Q&A function and we will try our best to resolve the issue. With that all said, let's begin. And I'll give the floor now to Hannah for our first presentation. Hannah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kwasigan. I will kick this event off with small input on why fossil gas is not the answer. In the work on the Climate Action Tracker, we've looked at the developments over the past years, particularly with the focus on gas, and we are a little bit worried about where this is going. Next slide, please. In our last briefing released at COP, we looked at production capacities for LNG, and we found that they are really overdimensioned if we are serious with Paris compatibility. So for Paris compatibility, no new oil and gas fields should be developed anywhere in the world, and global gas demand should already be declining. And this is reflected by the yellow line here in this graphic. So the existing LNG infrastructure, so what we can see here in the dark gray at the bottom, that already has to be built back before the end of its lifetime as of 2030 to be in line with Paris, with the Paris Agreement limits. And any additional infrastructure is really far beyond what's needed and what's useful. If we were to really build all of this infrastructure that's currently in planning and let it run until 2050, it would cost roughly 40 gigatons or 10% of the remaining global CO2 budget. And this is only LNG. Next slide, please. In another recent report by NewClimate Institute, we looked at the LNG terminals in Germany, and this is particularly looking at LNG import terminals. And we find even like for this rather small country, I guess, in the global context, we find they largely oversize their infrastructure planning. After the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Russian gas imports dropped, but the new plans that the government is currently pursuing could import 50% more gas than came in from Russia before the invasion. So this is really overcompensating what was lost. And in our analysis, we show that even the small amount of additional capacities needed could be compensated through additional savings and securing imports of neighboring countries. So in fact, actually very, very few, if at all, any LNG terminals would be necessary in Germany. And I think this example shows very nicely this current run for gas. It's going very quick. It's not necessarily based on what's most cost efficient. When we presented this graphic, many policymakers told us, yeah, okay, but we don't really know what's going to materialize, and energy security is really important at this point in time. And in the worst case, we just shut these things down before the end of their lifetime. So this is really, cost inefficient, and also sending potentially a false signal to other countries that could potentially be importing gas to Germany, and who are now potentially being made promises which can't be kept in the future. Next slide, please. In a report earlier this year, the Climate Action Tracker looked at how gas is developing in Africa, and we found that there's a lot of dynamics in the sector at the moment. There's a huge pipeline of new gas extraction pipelines, power plants, and LNG facilities generally. And on this graphic here, you can see these type of investments broken down. And basically all of them are multiplying, at least doubling roughly. And many countries are already producing oil and gas, but others are also just starting or planning to start. Next slide, please. Our report then goes on and looks what alternatives could be. And here's the example of Egypt, where we looked into job creation under different scenarios. The different scenarios here are 3 different share of renewables. And from top to bottom, it grows. So at the bottom, you have 82% renewables in 2035. And the x-axis shows the number of jobs that would be created under the different scenarios. And the higher the share of renewables, the higher the jobs created here. We also looked at other benefits like air pollution avoidance and other avoiding stranded assets generally in this report. And with this, I would hand over to Deborah, who will go into more the focus on the renewables.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So my part of the presentation will share some of the highlights of the energy transition issues in the region, and just note that this is by no means detailed, nor does it go into country-specific details. So it's basically broad, and this is mainly based on the report that has been done by Climate Analytics on renewable energy transition, mainly focusing on the sub-Saharan region. There are areas where I will be talking about Africa, and in some cases it will be sub-Saharan Africa. Based on data availability, in some cases, it was not possible to talk about just sub-Saharan Africa. So we all know energy access is still a big issue in Africa, with most people still lacking access to electricity. Majority of those are in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And to change this and overcome energy poverty would require rapid growth in electricity generation, with the IEA estimating in its 2022 Africa Outlook report that the region would need to nearly triple its power supply by 2030. This gives an indication of how big this is. Although it will not be easy to achieve this, it also presents a unique opportunity, I think, for the region, in that Africa has a large and growing demand for clean and affordable energy, which can be met by sustainable energy sources, particularly mainly because it has abundant renewable energy resources. Also, the region still has low levels of incumbent fossil fuel infrastructure, which could reduce the risk of stranded assets. As Hannah said earlier on, there is just no space for new fossil fuel infrastructure investments if we want to keep 1.5 alive. Also, as I said earlier, given its renewable energy resources, for example, Africa has the sun all year round, with about 60% of the world's solar resources, which is a good starting condition, I think, to scale up its efforts. But this will definitely require some international support to be able to unlock these opportunities. Next slide. So despite its abundant renewable energy resources, there is generally low investment in renewables in Africa. With the recent data from IRENA indicating that sub-Saharan Africa received only around 1.7% of global investments in renewable energy in the period between 2010 and 2020. That's tiny if you look at the population in the region. Renewables, like in many parts of the world, are still competing with fossil fuels. I think this is also one of the barriers. We're seeing financial institutions and investors that are still prioritizing fossil fuels over renewables. In recent years, we are seeing fossil fuel investments being around 6 to 7 times greater than what is being invested in renewables. And if we want to change this picture, this will need to change to increase the investments in renewables. However, it would require climate finance to fund the transition for Africa. Furthermore, some of the challenges include the high perceived risk of renewables investment in the region. And that has resulted in different challenges, like investors requiring a higher rate of return and projects facing high financing costs, and in some cases, very limited availability in general on long-term financing. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide is going to link to some of the points raised in Hannah's presentation. In terms of the push for gas, we still seeing the continued drive for fossil fuel development in Africa, and this is being sold as an opportunity for economic growth and helping Africa achieve its development goal of universal access to energy. That's what most of these people who want to invest in fossil fuels are basically presenting as the messaging. However, what is not being shared in this narrative is the risk of continued support for fossil fuels. We know that limiting global warming to 1.5 is fundamental for development, particularly in Africa, and we know that any new gas development is not compatible with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 temperature goal. The IEA in its report shows that there is no need to invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure, as Hannah said earlier on. And many countries that invest in gas development risks also looking at themselves in high emission pathways and stranded assets. This for Africa would also mean losing on economic opportunities to invest in renewables. As I said, there's abundant renewable energy resources in the continent, and that should be tapped into through international support. The other issue is that Africa is already settled with high levels of debt, and further investments in fossil fuels is likely to continue the debt burden from expensive fossil fuel infrastructure, and that could also worsen the poverty levels in the region and likely also increasing the dependency on international aid. And all of the above things that I've mentioned definitely do not support Africa's development objectives. So any messaging that says this is about Africa's development, we know it's not true. Next slide. In my closing slide, I will highlight some of the multiple benefits that could be realized by following a sustainable development pathway with increased use of renewable energy resources, and Africa has the opportunity to do so. Other than the obvious reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, basically implementing your mitigation programs, investing in renewables has the potential to increase job opportunities. IRENA in its recent study shows that the increase in job opportunities from renewables transition will substantially outweigh job losses in fossil fuel industry over the next decade in Africa. Also, investing in renewables will not only ensure energy security and independence, but will also in terms of energy prices, which can leave many countries unequipped to respond to this. Also, expanding renewable energy access would not only reduce these dependencies, but would stimulate economic growth, which is really required in Africa and could also allow the development of other sectors and industries. There's an opportunity to also develop new industries based on basically deployment of renewables in the region. And the obvious one, which is improved health from reduced air pollution. Over to you, Claire.
Great, thanks very much, Deborah. So what Deborah and Hannah have been presenting to you so far is really the type of analysis that we do at the global and regional level. But hopefully some of you are already familiar with some of the other work that CAT does at the country level. So we track 40 countries that represent over 80% of global emissions, and we track them where they are in terms of meeting the targets that they've set for themselves and their current policies. And we assess that in terms of what that means for end of century warming. So if you go to the next slide, please, Rangxi. I have up on here, just on the left, is the latest temperature estimates that we released at COP27. I'm not going to go through either of these images in great detail, but the point is just that we are far off from the 1.5 degree limit, regardless of whether you're looking at the temperatures or the state of policy implementation. The graph on the right just gives you that historical perspective that while we have been improving in the targets that countries have put forward and improving in the implementation, we're still far off. Since the Paris Agreement was adopted, we're still far off from 1.5 degrees. So that's really a lot of the core country level analysis that the CAT does. But a few years ago, we were looking, we wanted to sort of expand out the level of that analysis, because we know you can have the most ambitious target on the table, you can have the most brilliantly written policy. If it doesn't actually get implemented, we're not going to hit the 1.5 degree limit, and we're not going to stop dangerous climate change. So we really wanted to look at what are the enabling factors, what are the sort of soft criteria behind headline figures and policies that really enable countries to accelerate towards decarbonization. And so that's where this idea of looking at the governance side of things, not just sort of energy policy and emissions, came from. And so that was in 2018, we started to think about this, of how we could add that element. And if you go to the next slide, we, since that time, have produced, we've expanded the analysis out to over a dozen countries, with one more in the pipeline at the moment, and really tried to sort of deepen the type of analysis that the CAT does. If you can go to the next slide, Rangxi. So just a little bit of background about the framework. Obviously, a few years ago when we were developing this, it's not an easy task to do, because what we really want to sort of identify and get to is what are the core elements, critical elements that we need to ensure that a country is on the track to decarbonization. And we don't have much of an empirical basis to go from. No country has yet successfully decarbonized its economy, so we don't have a huge extensive literature on sort of what are the key critical factors that work. And then we also know that every country is slightly different. So when a piece of comprehensive climate legislation may be key in one country, that may not be as relevant for another one. So what we tried to do in the framework was really draw from the existing literature at the time, as well as our own experience, and really take an iterative approach. So we came up with our first framework in 2019, which we've refined over the years a couple of times. And now we have 28 indicators that we look at the national level to assess where we think countries are in terms of their climate governance. And these are broken up into 4 broad categories. The first is political commitment. So that's looking at things like, do you have high-level leadership from the head of state of the country, as well as the executive cabinet level? It's also looking at, is there broad party support? So is there a risk that if there was a change in government, that there would be backsliding in climate policy, or is it fairly standardized across, or it's a non-political issue, and therefore more likely that the climate policy will continue and develop and deepen rather than change with changing governments. The second category is the institutional framework. So there we're looking at things like, is there the structures in place to ensure effective communication across governments at the national level, between national and subnational governments. It's also looking at knowledge infrastructure. So is there an entity capable of advising a government on what it needs to do to achieve net zero emissions? Is the government receptive to receiving and taking on that type of advice? The third category is policy processes. So that's really looking at, does the government have the policies and processes in place to implement the policies that it's passing? And there's a key focus on, does it have the legislative framework? Does it have a transparency framework? Does it have a ratchet up mechanism? And then the final category is stakeholders, and is the government sort of willing and able to take into consideration their concerns as it's developing and implementing policies? So that's at a very general level, the broad framework and the categories. And then if you go to the next slide, what we do for each of the indicators is we score it on a 5-point scale. And then we aggregate up those scores at both the sort of criteria level and then the category level. And that comes up with on a sort of traffic-like color coding system that goes from very poor to advanced. And you'll see that a little bit more when Kofi presents actually walks you through some of the results. And so the idea there, what we really wanted to do with this series was, first off, provide a way to compare the state of climate governance readiness across countries, because that's the sort of core element of many of the things that we do at the CAT. But we also wanted to see if we could highlight examples of where countries are doing well, what sort of systems have they put in place that are functioning that could potentially serve as examples for others, and then also highlight areas where we think countries need to focus more and advance work in the area. So that in a very broad nutshell is the governance framework. And now I'll turn it over to Kofi to present you the detailed results.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks for the participants. My focus will be to highlight the results of our analysis in 3 countries. And as a quick reminder, I will say that the CAT assessment analyzes the country's climate governance framework for their ability and readiness to transition to a zero-emission society. So far, we have already conducted the assessment in 13 countries around the world, of which we have 8 countries in Africa. So for our focus this afternoon, we will highlight the results of three countries in Africa, namely Rwanda, Senegal, and Nigeria. So next slide, please. So for Rwanda, it is a report that we have released very recently in August 2022. And as you can see, according to the image or the screenshot at the left of the slides, Rwanda is a country that has a very good level of climate governance in the region here. As you can see it, the category of our indicators, in two of the categories, Rwanda has scored at an acceptable level, which means Rwanda has a score between 60 and 80% of the global score, and on 2 of the categories, Rwanda has an acceptable level of climate governance ability and readiness. And as highlights of our main recommendations, we have first of all raised our we recommend at the effective coordination level that Rwanda needs to establish an interministerial coordination mechanism with clear mandate and designated member actors to enhance coordination between line ministries and between central and sector and district governments. At the knowledge infrastructure level, we highlight that Rwanda has to establish an expert and advisory body to support transition-related policy development. And the third main recommendation is for Rwanda to develop a long-term strategy, including a pathway to meet the country's 2050 net zero CO2 emissions goal. And also, we recommend that Rwanda needs to develop a climate change law to enshrine the country's NDC target and 2050 net zero CO2 emissions goal into a law, as well as outline its governance framework, especially around an interministerial coordination mechanism. And finally, here we have made highlights on the just transition in Rwanda. Though Rwanda is a country that doesn't exploit gas, we need here to highlight the fact that Rwanda has to develop a just transition strategy and to promote green jobs in to the policy development process. Maybe in the Q&A sessions, we will come back for more explanation on how why we have made this recommendation, though Rwanda is a country where there is no gas exploitation. Next slide, please. On for Senegal, we can, as we can see it on the screenshot, Senegal also is a report that we have released in August, maybe 1 week after the Rwanda report. In Senegal, the climate governance framework for transition to a zero emission society is a bit is in the midway, because 3 of the categories have scored neutral, and have also scored limited, as we can see it, and only the institutional framework has scored neutral. So the main recommendation that we have made for Senegal is that Senegal, at the high level government leadership, as you can see it, Senegal, the officials like the head of the states and also the relevant ministries, they have to strengthen their commitment in order to support the transition to a zero emission society, and especially by focusing their attention on the renewable energy. At the knowledge infrastructure level, and also effective coordination level, we can see that we need here that Senegal has to strengthen the functioning of the National Committee on Climate Change, which is the COMNAC, because this institution is a very good example of effective coordination. But the institution is encountering a certain level of difficulty. So here the highlight is to strengthen the functioning of this committee in order to address its long-standing operational constraints. And also we need that in Senegal, there is a new mandate, an existing entity to provide transition-related advice to the government. And also here in Senegal, we have found that there is some effort to develop a long-term low carbon development strategy. So we have to, Senegal has to continue the effort in order to achieve this, to achieve the development of its long-term low development strategy. Next slide, please. So the Nigeria report, it is also a report that we published this year, but at the beginning of the year in February 2022. So as you can see it also in Nigeria, the climate governance for a transition to a zero emission society is mitigated, because here we have 3 of the categories that have scored as a limited one, and we have only 1 category, like the policy processes, that has scored in average. So this, especially this category, I mean, policy processes has scored in average, because in 2021, Nigeria was one of those African countries that has passed its climate law, which we mean here the Climate Change Act of 2021. So this is why this category has scored a very an average. So as main recommendation, we have requested, or we are suggesting that Nigeria focus its efforts on the implementation of this new climate law, because the implementation of this law could ensure swift implementation of the institutional framework established under the law, and also in that the implementation of this law could also help the country to address some difficulties in the coordination of all climate-related activities. So this is the main thing that we would like to highlight on this slides, in addition to the fact that also at the high level, a summit of the country, the country has, or the government has, to strengthen the leadership on the transition to a zero emission society. Next slide, please. So, and here we have some report that we have released before the three that we have yet right now presented. So in order to compare, but not with score, just to put highlights on these three reports. We have the report of South Africa that we have published in October 2020. So we can see that, like Rwanda, South Africa is a country where the climate governance is well advanced, because 2 of the categories of the criteria have scored at acceptable level, and the 2 of the 2 other one also have scored very on average. For Ghana, for Ghana, here the climate governance is also somehow and somewhat advanced, because 3 of the category of indicators have scored on average, and the one, like we mean the policy processes have scored in very limited. And for Kenya has the same structure, or the same structure, climate governance structure, like Ghana, because 2 of the categories have also scored in average, and the 2 other ones also scored in acceptable level. So in order to compare all of them, like we pick 2 criteria by country. We mean high-level governance leadership and the knowledge structure. We can find that in Ghana and Kenya, the recommendation, there is a common link in the recommendations. So in Ghana and Kenya, the main common recommendation is to strengthen the political commitment on climate mitigation and on the transition to a zero-emission society. And at the knowledge infrastructure level, the main recommendation here is to, like in South Africa, to bring the government to establish an advisory body that could be able to provide the government with advice on the processes to a net zero emission society in order to enable all these countries to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, the Paris Agreement goal. So these are the main highlights of the report that we published so far this year, and we thank you. We're waiting for your questions to deep more on our findings. So hand over back to Kwasigan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kofi, and to the other colleagues for your presentation, and also thanks to the attendees who have submitted some questions already. And we will try to respond to as many of your questions as possible within the remaining time of this webinar. So my first question will go to Deborah. You touched upon enabling conditions for renewable energy transition on the continent. So we know there has been a lot of attention paid to just energy transition partnerships lately. So would that model work to support African renewable energy development, in your opinion?
Thanks, Kwasigan. I think I must start by saying African countries are not homogeneous, and that applies to how you would want to approach their decarbonization. The same applies to development. You would want to zoom into country-specific details. For instance, institutional barriers in a particular country are not necessarily the case for another country, and hence the country's specific issues would be critical. So you will need to get into country-specific details and move away from the broad generalizations that if something is is applied to one African country, it can be applied to others. When it comes to the JETP, I think there are a few countries. There are a few countries that are similar in structure that have also fossil fuels that have been basically dependent on fossil fuels that could benefit from a partnership like the Just Energy Transition partnership. However, I think there are countries, particularly those with small economies, that would require a different model, and the international community needs to start thinking about the different kind of countries and structures that you have and come up with different forms of partnerships for different countries. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah, for the elements of answer. Since we have many questions coming, I will try to ask as many as possible. So my next question will go to Hannah. In your presentation, you show a graph showing the capacity of German LNG terminals. So what is the difference between imports and additional imports in concrete terms from your presentation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The difference is that imports is what was already available before the Russian invasion, and additional imports is what our neighboring countries here around Germany additionally then supplied after the Russian gas cut off. And it was interesting to see how fast they were able to supply additional gas to Germany. And what is important to know is that all of this is done through pipelines. Transporting pipelines, gas through pipelines is much cheaper than transporting LNGs. You have much fewer losses. So it will always be the cheaper option. And that leaves a lot of doubts on the economical feasibility and competitiveness of imported LNG gas in the future.
Thank you very much, Hannah. This will go to Claire. So since you presented the methodology and some of the elements, that go into the analysis of the CAT work, how do you prioritize the country that you choose to analyze, for example? How do you do that prioritization? Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, again. Great question. And there's not sort of one specific answer to that. We take a variety of things into consideration. So one of the things that we do with all of the CAT work is looking at the type of impact that we hope we can have with that. So for instance, this year we did a governance profile of Egypt, and we also added Egypt to the tracker proper, of countries where we track emissions and their progress towards achieving their targets. And of course, we did that because Egypt was had the presidency of the COP this year. So we thought it would be a great moment to sort of shine a spotlight on where they are in terms of both of their targets and their emissions, as well as their climate governance. In other cases, we've been adding countries to the tracker, or we've done the governance report first and then thought, oh, it would be great to add them to the tracker proper. So that's the cases with Colombia and Kenya. And I mean, generally what we try and do with all of the CAT analysis is really ensure that we have a regional balance. Now, when I say that, I recognize that we have very poor regional balance at the moment in governance with respect to North America and Europe. So we are still working through our plans for where to take the governance framework next year, but we do, if we do more profiles, we'll definitely look in that area to try and expand that aspect. And then finally, just as a funder-based organization, we do also are responsive to the interests of those that support our work. So I think that's the general answer there.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think you will I will come back to you with the next question, probably you and Kofi. So could you say more about, talking still about the climate governance framework, could you say more about the state capture by fossil fuel sector interest? And what about civil society engagement, freedom of speech and association, for example?
Great. So maybe I'll start off on a general level, and then Kofi, you can come in with respect to Rwanda, if you'd like. So, I mean, both of those, the capture by the fossil fuel industry is a very important indicator. So when I showed the sort of 4 broad categories that we have, The fourth category is stakeholder engagement, and there we have 7 indicators that we look at, and 2 of those are looking at both the extent to which industry is influential on the government, either the fossil fuel sector or also the flip side, those that potentially will benefit from the transition, so the renewable energy sector. And obviously the rationale and thinking there is if you've got a very powerful fossil fuel lobby that has the potential to limit the implementation of policy, and likewise if you have a strong renewable energy industry, you could hopefully accelerate the extent of the or accelerate the pace of the transition. So we do look at those 2 indicators. On the civil society question, we look more broadly at the steps that the government is taking to ensure buy-in. And as part of that, we do look to the extent that we are able at the sort of strength of civil society and whether they're really active within the country and whether that they can push the government as well as also help popularize policies that the government is trying to implement on climate policy. And then we look specifically at what the government is doing to ensure a just transition. So those are all very important elements. Now, from a research perspective, we do try and do some interviews within country, but we are largely desktop based. So we do look at a variety of different variety of different sort of research sources for those, but I can say that those are some of the more difficult indicators in the tracker to assess and track. I don't know, Kofi, if you wanted to come in specifically on Rwanda.
Yeah, I can say some word specifically on Rwanda very quickly. In Rwanda, for example, we have the Climate Change and Development Network, which is an umbrella group of civil society organizations that are active on climate change fields, and this network counts about 70 NGOs member. So with this organization, this organization works closely with the government in order to develop some projects that they submitted to the FONRWA, Rwanda National Fund for Environment. So this project targets, for example, the sensitizing activities in order to bring all the citizens in order to help the government in climate processes, and also this group acts sometimes like an advocate group for some projects that has some climate and environmental risk, in order to bring the government to change the orientations of this project to make them more climate friendly. So this is kind of what we have in Rwanda, for example, and also we have the Rwanda Environmental NGOs Forum, which work closely with the Ministry of Environment to develop some projects to promote clean cooking stoves around the country. So and for the in energy sector, we have the energy developers and energy private developers, which is an organization, an association of private energy sector for renewable energy in Rwanda. So with this organization, they focus on both renewable energy and how to help or accompany the government to phase out all fossil energy uses in the country. So this is some a specific example of what is done in Rwanda, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kofi. And the next one goes to you in the same vein, like the question that you just answered specifically about Rwanda. You provided in your presentation a rich analysis of the current state of climate governance in a number of countries. And is there one example of a country doing something well that you think is a model for others? And is there any area where you think a number of countries need to pay more attention to?
Okay, this question I will answer by taking some specific indicators, because all the countries, as Deborah already said it, all the countries, they do not have an homogeneous situation. On some fields, some countries are doing good, even if globally they do not score well. On some other indicators, some countries, they scored well, but they do not good on that specific indicator. So I will maybe very quickly take example of 2 or 3 indicators to highlight what is being done well in these countries. For example, if I take them Rwanda, on the aspect of climate finance mobilizing, because we have an indicator that is focused on climate finance mobilization. So on this aspect specifically, the FONRUA, meaning the Rwanda Fund for Rwanda National Fund for Environment, it is a very good model that some other countries can take example on, because this fund, like in the at COP26, for example, the executive director of the GCF, they have been asked a question like, how do you see climate finance mobilization in Africa? And his answer was very simple. He has answered this way: if it comes to think about climate finance mobilization in Africa, I think FONRUA is one of the best examples. So I think that this is a very good structure of this fund has a very good structure of climate finance mobilization. And I think it is a very good illustration that some other countries can take example on. So that is the indicator of climate finance mobilization. If we take the indicator of knowledge infrastructure, for example, we can take the example of South Africa. South Africa, where we have some advisory panel that help government by providing the government with advice, with knowledge on how to conduct the transition to a zero emission society. So the functioning, the organization, and the specificities of this panel, I think it is also a very good thing that some countries can take example on. And finally, we can also take the example of the indicator related to effective coordination, where we can say that what is being done in Senegal with COMNAC, the National Committee on Climate Change. This institution, it has also a very good structure of how to bring experts of all sectors, of all aspects of climate change together in order to mobilize expertise, and also the coordination of how the government needs to conduct activities in a coordinated way. So besides I can say besides the financial resources and other some constraints that this national committee is facing, its organization and how it's functioning is also a very good example that countries can see and can build their own example on effective coordination of all climate related activities on. So I think globally, I can take these 3 examples to answer the question. Maybe if there is also another question, we can say we can come more in details on some other specific aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kofi, for your detailed explanation and element of answer, specifically touching upon some of those structures existing in the different countries that are really conducive to a good climate governance leading to decarbonization. So I will now turn to Claire, who actually presented this impressive climate governance framework. And we would like to know, for example, in terms of implementing some of the recommendations from your analysis or coming out from that analytical framework, what will be the point of advisory bodies if governments are still able up to a point or to ignore the given advice from your analytical research, for example?
Thanks, Kosiga. Yeah, I mean, obviously we would like the government to listen to the advice of its advisory panel, but I think there still is a lot of value in having those structures, even if the government is not willing at the moment for one reason or another to pay attention to that advice. And I can give you an example from the CAT's own experience. So in the case of the UK, we do in our country analysis rely a lot on the analysis that their Climate Change Commission puts out, that evaluates the strength of their policies and whether they've got all of the implementation and all of the measures put in place to actually implement those policies. And so we really took that advice and that analysis that they had put out into our own ranking system when we were coming up with how to assess the state of the policy implementation in the UK. So I think that's just one example. There's a lot of others, and I think the importance of having that information out there from an independent body, so that a variety of stakeholders either within the country or outside of it can have access to that information. There's a lot of value there that can hopefully also feed that analysis and that information back to governments in other ways. And then the second sort of broad element that I would suggest is that we should never underestimate the amount of time that it takes to set up these institutions and the sort of institutional learning when you are putting an advisory body in place and then finding their feet and working together and things like that. So building this infrastructure and deepening it and sort of really integrating it into the policy analysis does take time. And unfortunately, in climate change, time is one of the things that we have the least. So even if a government at a particular moment in time is not really interested in hearing the advice of its advisory body, just maintaining that body, having them put out sort of good quality analysis ensures that when the government is ready to listen to that type of advice, that you have that structure in place. So I think from a broad standpoint, those would be the two aspects that I would point to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. I think these are very interesting questions. We do have a lot of questions, but I will try to prioritize due to time constraint. So my next one will go to Deborah. Because you touch upon the enabling conditioning of renewable energy on the continent, can you tell us more about what, in your opinion, are the main reason investments into renewable energy are limited when it comes to the African continent?
Thanks, Kosigan. I'll keep it short so that we can take more questions. So there's two similar questions. I think I will take two. It's one about the limited investments in renewables, but there's also a question, and I'm going to respond to both of them together. There's another one that talks to barriers to scaling up renewables in Africa. I think, as I've said earlier, you will need country-specific data. The data is scarce on what individual countries' barriers are. For instance, you have countries like South Africa, one of the preferred countries for renewable energy investment in the region, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the model that is being applied in South Africa can work for another country. So you'll have to zoom into those details. When it comes to broad elements, though, I think there's various elements of why renewables are not scaling up at the required pace. And one of those is that there's still competition with fossil fuels. Financial institutions and investors are still prioritizing fossil fuels over renewables. That's a financial barrier. There's also inadequate availability of finance. And I have seen in the recent IEA report where they show how to catalyze the financing. For instance, things like supporting energy system planning and market design could also help with that. Strengthening the bankability of projects, it's one element that could also enable the investment. Supporting and facilitating the development of domestic financial initiatives, it's one of those. But you also have other barriers, for instance, institutional barriers, which is about basically a need to improve regulatory framework, working with individual countries, for instance, those that have fossil fuel subsidies, to try and reform those and direct those resources towards renewables. Let me pause here because there's a few other questions.
Thanks, Deborah. I think we will only have time for one more question before we get into our closing session. So going the same vein regarding renewable energy in Africa. So Hannah, If all African countries go to renewable energy, will the production capacity of wind and solar equipment manufacturers sufficient if all the countries go renewable energy on the continent?
Yeah, thank you. We have not done the math of that. What we've seen for the countries that we looked at in our report, that the capacities would have to increase really dramatically, and naturally this has to happen very fast, and likely definitely local production wouldn't be able to supply that, so imports would be required for renewable technologies. I think it's not so much a question of what is technically possible. I mean, Deborah already explained a lot of the barriers, and what I think is important that those are being tackled, and that countries really put forward plans on what they want to do with renewable energy and how fast they want to proceed. And then that's a matter of making that possible somehow. And then the international production chains and supply chains and so on will adjust one by one. What's important is indeed international cooperation on this, including climate finance and making access to these technologies available, potentially also supporting local production or national production chains, etc. So it is a tremendous challenge, and of course it's not done within a day, but honestly, if we're serious with 1.5 degrees Celsius, then that's kind of what we have to do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you very much to all your answers to the questions. Now we are very nearing the end of this event, but before we close, I would like to give each speaker 1 minute to briefly provide us with a key message, and we will start with Hannah. Briefly, 1 minute to provide a key message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think with the different inputs today, we've seen how critical it is to not let gas take over also on the African continent, and avoiding a lock-in, and with many benefits that renewables can provide, it seems like the best option, at least in the medium to long term. And it comes with many challenges, and the colleagues have looked in more depth on the governance, can definitely add to those. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Deborah?
Thanks, Kosigan. I think, as I've said, there is great opportunity in the region. With the right support, Africa can unlock its low carbon opportunities to support its development objectives for sustainable economic growth that is necessary to grow the economy in the continent, and also for climate resilient future of the continent. So it really needs support, but you need the right support. What we have seen in terms of what has been going into the continent has not helped in scaling up renewables, for instance.
Thank you, Deborah. Kofi?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I will, my closing word will be like an answer to a question here that is saying, since you have gained so much insight from all this analysis, how optimistic or pessimistic do you feel over the long term? I will answer saying that we are optimistic, because more and more countries have understood that we need to tackle climate change crisis and development crisis in an integrated way. And more countries are going in that way. More and more countries are developing their long-term strategies, their long-term low carbon development strategies. So the understanding of what we have to do to tackle climate crisis is here, and it is being more and more done in an integrated approach. So we are optimistic that countries are going in the right direction, and over the long term, the 1.5 goal of Paris Climate Agreement will be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kofi. Now to Claire.
Thanks, Kosige. Well, first, I'd like to thank the audience. We had some really great questions today, especially on the governance framework, which I very much appreciate. I guess my closing thoughts are just to go back to the CAD thermometer, which we updated at COP27, which show the 2030 targets that are on the table would only limit warming to 2.4 degrees. and policies are only sufficient to limit warming to 2.7 degrees, which is well above the 1.5 degree limit. I do think we are heading, building on Kofi's answer, in the right direction, and our analysis over the past decade has shown that those temperature estimates are coming down. They're just not coming down fast enough. So we cannot take our foot off of the accelerator, and climate governance will play a very important role in ensuring that the policies that are on paper actually take shape and help us bring that temperature estimate down so that we can achieve 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire, and thanks to all of you. I think we will close this on this optimism note from Kofi and from the other colleagues. It's very important to know that there are opportunities for renewable energy deployment and for decarbonization processes on the continent. And as you all presented, there's required is some internal work from the countries and also some external supports for achievement. So before we close, I would like to share that the recording and the slides will be made available on the CAT's website and sent to those who registered. Once again, thank you very much for your participation, and thanks to all the attendees, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.